Throughout the ages, there have been great empires and civilizations that have risen up, their creators ruling nations, regions, and continents for hundreds, even thousands of years. Some of the great legacies and accomplishments of these empires may be lost in the mists of time, but from what they have left behind in rock and ruin, we can trace remarkable stories. In this episode of Empire Builders, we explore the last hurrah of Europe's imperial dynasties in France, Russia, and the Austrian Habsburg Empire, whose royal palaces, cathedrals, and other great public buildings of the 18th and 19th centuries memorialize the dramatic final chapter of the rise and fall of Imperial Europe.
There's a sort of incredible, sort of inspirational, cultural glitter, if you like, around French culture, which is very, very attractive to the rest of Europe and indeed the rest of the world. This is a culture to cherish as well as to admire.
The Habsburgs are much more successful than most other dynasties in Europe. And if you go to Vienna, it's an incredible city because you have this enormous imperial city now in a very small country.
The history of Imperial Russia teaches us both about the success of monarchies, but also about the way in which monarchies fail. The Russian monarchy was sowing the seeds of its own destruction.
Europe between the late 18th and early 20th centuries was carved up into great competing empires, amongst the most powerful of which were the empires of France, the Austrian Habsburgs, and by far the biggest of them all, Russia. In this episode, we travel back in time to feature the compelling stories of some of the most famous buildings from the last glorious finale of Europe's great empires. Our story starts in the late 18th century in Paris, France. Located in the heart of Paris, the extremely grand Louvre Palace was the French monarchy's main residence during much of the 16th and 17th centuries. After 1682, however, once the royal family had moved out of Paris in order to live in the even grander Palace of Versailles in the countryside, the old Palace of the Louvre in Paris was simply used to house the king's vast private art collection. Today, of course, the Louvre is renowned as one of the world's greatest public museums, displaying a remarkable 40,000 works of art, including numerous world-famous treasures, such as Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. The museum first opened to the public back in 1793 as a result of the momentous events of the French Revolution. Not only were the French king and his wife Marie Antoinette amongst tens of thousands executed by guillotine, but the great royal art collection in the Louvre was also appropriated by the revolutionaries and opened for public appreciation. Initially, the number of artworks on public display in the Louvre was just 700 or so. It wasn't long, however, before the museum's collections began to expand dramatically, following the coup d'etat in 1799 that led to the French Revolution's greatest military leader, Napoleon Bonaparte, being named consul or dictator of France for a period of 10 years.
Napoleon is a fantastic self-propagandist, and quite early on he sees the potential of the Louvre to add to his glory.
As the result of a succession of military triumphs abroad, which brought him huge popularity and the title of consul or dictator for life, Napoleon began filling up the Louvre with numerous world-famous artworks that he'd seized as the spoils of war from Egypt, Italy, and elsewhere.
It was at this time that the new director of the museum, a man called Vivant de Nom, who was also a consummate courtier, told Napoleon, "Wouldn't it be a good idea if we named this museum after you, sir?" And of course, Napoleon said, "Good idea." So at that point, in 1803, the museum, this Musée Central des Arts, Central Museum of Arts, became known as the Musée Napoléon, the Napoleon Museum.
By the following year, Napoleon had decided that the title of consul or dictator for life was no longer grand enough to match his exalted status. And so in December 1804, he had himself crowned Emperor of the French. Amidst great splendor, his coronation took place at the great cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris, with France's most famous painter of the era, Jacques-Louis David, on hand to paint the official visual record of the occasion.
Napoleon loved this picture, famously said, "Oh, look at this picture, you walk in this picture, it's fantastic." And it is incredible. You can see all of the individual faces. People came in specially to be painted, each one as a little portrait in itself. David famously adds Napoleon's mother. Napoleon's mother wasn't there, she was with his brother, Lucien. And it's almost like Napoleon has painted his mother in so he can say, "Look at me, Ma." And then right up at the very top of the painting, you can see there's a man with a sketchbook, and that's David painting himself into the picture, which is very charming, of course.
Given that the French Revolution had abolished the monarchy just 12 years before, however, Napoleon's grandiose coronation of himself as emperor was widely, if secretly, disparaged in France too.
A lot of his colleagues from revolutionary days are very disappointed because it looks a bit like the Ancien Regime. It looks like the old world coming back. And fortunately for Napoleon, a year later, to the very day, the Battle of Austerlitz happens on the 2nd of December. And then Napoleon has another coronation, a military coronation this time, the great battle, the fantastic victory. And so in the ceremonies that take place every year on the 2nd of December, which is Coronation Day and Austerlitz Day, it's Austerlitz Day, which is also Coronation Day. So Austerlitz Day takes over as the big memory symbol of Napoleonic might and Napoleonic power.
It was to celebrate his great victory in 1805 at the Battle of Austerlitz over the combined forces of the Russian and Habsburg empires that Napoleon built the famous Arc de Triomphe on the Avenue des Champs-Élysées. Austerlitz was such an important victory, however, that one triumphal arch wasn't enough. Next to the Louvre, Napoleon had this second one built, known as the Arc de Triomphe de Carousel. More battlefield victories followed in Prussia and elsewhere, until by 1812, Napoleon's growing empire was at its maximum extent and seemingly unstoppable. But then, Napoleon made a huge mistake. In June 1812, his massive army, numbering over 500,000 men, attacked Russia.
Napoleon is an utterly ambitious ruler. He believes that he's there to spread French revolutionary zeal as far as he possibly can. And in particular, Central and Eastern Europe appear to be the most backward, benighted parts of the continent. These are the parts of the continent that need French virtue imposing upon them.
Initially, things looked like going well for Napoleon. His troops won a series of battles against the Russians, and by September, Napoleon was able to lead his army into Moscow and set up his headquarters in the Kremlin. But Napoleon's problem was the vast distance that his army had had to cover to get to Moscow. And with an overextended supply chain for food and other essentials, many of his troops were in a badly weakened condition. The onset of the ferociously cold Russian winter made things immeasurably worse. And so by October, Napoleon's great army was forced into ignominious retreat back towards France.
Napoleon's army is destroyed as it makes its way west from Moscow during the winter. General winter, that the Russians came to call it. Winter was a great weapon in their armoury.
Out of Napoleon's original army of more than 500,000 men, less than 30,000 made it back to France fighting fit. Around 100,000 of Napoleon's troops were captured, while nearly 400,000 died, most of them not in battle, but from the cold, starvation and disease.
The defeat of Napoleon was of immense significance for the Russian state. Russia had turfed out an invader which had got almost to the very heart of its state. St. Petersburg, it becomes decorated with monuments to mark this victory.
This grand triumphal arch, for example, is decorated with images of the goddess of victory flying on Russian cannonballs used against Napoleon's army. And not far away, there's also this triumphal arch, specifically designed to mimic and mock the triumphal arch that Napoleon had built a few years before in Paris to celebrate defeating Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz. In Moscow, meanwhile, the Kremlin, which had been badly damaged by fire and explosions set off by Napoleon's retreating army, was now rebuilt, more magnificent than ever. And nearby the Kremlin, to fulfill a promise that Tsar Alexander I had made on Christmas Day 1812, a great new cathedral was commissioned to give thanks to the Russian army and God for saving the nation from Napoleon. This was the original plan for the cathedral, but when Tsar Alexander died in 1825, the new Tsar, Nicholas I, so disliked its neo-classical style that he overturned the decision. Instead, Nicholas I chose this design, with its 5 orthodox domes harmoniously arranged in a very Russian style, which he thought much more appropriate for a patriotic building project. The work of turning the new design into reality finally began in 1839 and took more than 40 years to complete. Built beside the Moscow River at nearly 350 feet high, the spectacular Cathedral of Christ the Saviour is still today the tallest Orthodox Christian church in the world. Its size and grandeur is symbolic. For Russians, the defeat of Napoleon's invasion is second only in historic significance to the defeat of invasion by Nazi Germany. During the War of 1812, over 200,000 Russian soldiers were killed defending their homeland, and their sacrifice is honored here.
Now we're in the corridor of military glory in the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour. Here you can see the memorial plaques, which telling the story of the Patriotic War of 1812. Altogether, there are 155 memorial plaques describing every single battle which was given to Napoleonic army during that patriotic war. In first place, there's the name of the city, village, or place where the battle was held. Then who was in commander in that battle, and what regiments participating, who were killed, wounded, and awarded after the battle.
To sufficiently honor the soldiers and God who had protected Russia so well, the cathedral was built on an extremely grand scale. Surprisingly, however, the cathedral as we see it today isn't the original one. It's a replica, completed in the year 2000. Despite its commemoration of a great Russian patriotic war, the original was destroyed under communist rule by Stalin.
After the revolution of 1917, all religions were prohibited by the government of the Soviet Union. And they started with Moscow churches. They demolished them with explosions. And our church, the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, was also exploded in December of 1931.
Remarkably, on the site of the demolished cathedral, Stalin intended to construct what would then have been the world's tallest building. The 100-story high palace of the Soviets was planned to rise to over 1,300 feet, plus a huge 300-foot statue of Lenin at the top. Building work did in fact start with the laying of foundations, but the extraordinary project had to be stopped when Germany invaded Russia in the Second World War. After the war was over, the palace of the Soviets' unused foundations were cleared away in the late 1950s, and for the next 35 years or so, the site became the world's largest open-air swimming pool. In the late 1980s, however, the collapse of the Soviet Union opened up new possibilities.
Only in 1980s, in the end of the Soviet power, people decided to reconstruct their memory, traditions, and history. And the decision was made to reconstruct the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which was seen as a symbol of Russian unity and intercession of God for the Russian nation. Fortunately, very many pictures and documents were found about the cathedral, as well as the sketches of the outstanding painters who painted the church. And during a 5-year period, everything was rebuilt again. The church was consecrated to the name of Christ the Savior in the year 2000. To rebuild the cathedral, the cost is estimated as $800 million.
One of the many curiosities of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior is that the construction of the original cathedral in the 19th century was on such a grand scale that although it was built to celebrate the famous victory over Napoleon in 1812, it was still being built in the 1850s, by which time Russia was being disastrously defeated in the Crimean War by an alliance of the Ottoman Empire, Britain, and France. In general, the main reason for Russia's defeat in the Crimean War was its failure to modernize as rapidly as the other major powers of Europe. On the battlefield, the other great European empires had much more up-to-date military equipment and transportation to bring in supplies, for example. While back at home, this modernizing drive was demonstrated by the radical redesign of many of Europe's ancient capital cities at this time. In Paris in particular, during the 1850s and 60s, the city's prefect of public works, George Haussmann, had entire districts of old, narrow streets in the city centre demolished, replacing them with the grand wide boulevards that give Paris its distinctive appearance today. Elsewhere, the Habsburg Empire's ancient imperial capital, Vienna, was also completely redeveloped at this time. Remarkably, right up until the 1850s, Vienna's city centre was unchanged since medieval times, enclosed by massive city walls and surrounded by an ancient moat that had been filled in to create parkland. A new, modern city was starting to grow up around it, but completely cut off from the marooned city centre. redesign was crucial if Vienna was to enter the modern age. So in 1857, Emperor Franz Joseph ordered the demolition of the old city walls and the construction of a grand new circular boulevard in place of the old moat. To beautify the new inner ring road, a series of grand, opulent buildings were constructed all along it from the 1860s onwards, deliberately built in a variety of historic architectural styles in order to reflect the Habsburg Empire's supposed links to the great cultures of the past. The Habsburgs were justifiably proud of Vienna's flourishing artistic and cultural life. This, for example, is the grand neo-Baroque Imperial Court Theatre. The most important art of the Habsburg Empire, however, was music, which was part of Vienna's lifeblood. Vienna, of course, was the home of the waltz and the adopted home of Mozart. So for the Habsburgs, one of the most important of all the new buildings along the Ringstrasse was the one dedicated to the great musical art of opera. Majestically gracing the Ringstrasse, the Opera House was the first of all the grand public buildings on the Ring Road to be completed in 1868. Uniquely amongst the Ring Road's major buildings, the Opera House was built in neo-Renaissance style, with harmonious geometrical arches and columns. This particular architectural style was chosen since it was during the Renaissance that opera originated.
What impresses me the most every time I walk into that opera is the symbolism everywhere. It's just magnificent. For example, look here on the balustrade, you see the initials of Emperor Francis Joseph. Up there are the two reliefs, ballet and opera, things that are played here every day. And below them, you see the reliefs of the architects, both of them. For me, this feels actually like a cathedral, this entrance room. Look, the windows up there. Behind those windows is the tea salon. This is where the emperor was sitting in the intermission. Here, this is the private tea salon of Emperor Francis Joseph. You can see all over his initials. Also here, for example, on the top above the mirror, FJ1. Here you can also see the two-headed eagle. The double-headed eagle was the coat of arms of the Holy Roman Empire, which existed until the year 1806. 2 years before then, the so-called Austrian Empire was established, and the Habsburgs used that coat of arms again. We are now in the auditorium of the opera. This is the box where the emperor was sitting when he attended a play. Above it, actually, you can see an eagle. It's a one-headed eagle. It's not the two-headed eagle of the Austrian Empire. It's the coat of arms of the Republic of Austria.
150 years after the Vienna Opera House was first opened in the presence of Emperor Franz Joseph, it is still indisputably one of the most prestigious opera houses in the world, continuing a Viennese tradition of musical excellence that dates back centuries.
On the first day of the opera, when it was opened in May 1869, the whole nobility of the Austro-Hungarian Empire gathered. On that opening evening, there was Mozart played. And actually, the most famous opera at that time already was The Magic Flute, but they decided to play Don Giovanni.
Despite the musical traditions of the Habsburgs, Emperor Franz Joseph didn't much like opera, however, finding it boring. He was quite often seen to fall asleep during a performance, and perhaps to avoid the possibility on this gala occasion, it's believed he slipped away early after Act 1. Surprisingly, perhaps, the opera house itself was also unpopular amongst the general public as a work of architecture.
People did not like it. They said it looks like an elephant digesting or a sunken chest. The main reason was because of the street level of the Ringstraße. It looked like a bit sunken. And all the other buildings, if you look at on the Ring Road, they have ramps where you go up to the Palace of Politics, to the Palace of Culture, but to the Palace of Music, there is no ramp. Both architects, Eduard van der Nühl and August Sickert von Siggertsburg, were not alive when that opera house was opened. Main reason was actually the criticism from the Viennese, from the people here in the city, that made Eduard van der Nühl so sad that he actually committed suicide. His life friend and architect partner, Siggertsburg, died a few weeks later on a heart attack or tuberculosis. It's not 100% sure. Actually, maybe because of a broken heart, because he lost his life partner and architect friend.
Another derogatory Viennese nickname for the disliked opera house was the Königgrätz of architecture. The Battle of Königgrätz, which took place in 1866 while the opera house was being built, had resulted in a disastrous defeat for the Austrian Imperial Army at the hands of the growing power of Prussia. One of the consequences of this military defeat was that Emperor Franz Joseph was forced to reconcile with the Habsburg Empire's restive province of Hungary.
That is what is usually referred to as the Compromise of 1867, where effectively we get the empire split in two. It becomes Austria-Hungary. There are some institutions in common foreign policy, common army, but Hungary really is has a large amount of home rule after 1867.
As part of the compromise, Franz Joseph remained not only the Emperor of Austria, but also the King of Hungary. Nevertheless, the Hungarians were able to celebrate a substantial degree of autonomy in domestic affairs. To honor this momentous occasion in Hungary's history, an architectural competition was launched to design an appropriately magnificent new parliament building to be built in the capital, Budapest, beside the Danube.
When there were plans to build this, the Hungarian Prime Minister, who was usually quite a thrifty person, basically said, no, we should spare no expense on this. We've got to produce a building which will impress both our friends and our enemies.
Today, the winning design is one of Europe's grandest and most spectacular public buildings. Construction of Hungary's extraordinarily grand parliament building took nearly 20 years, from 1885 to 1904. Displaying an exceptionally harmonious mix of different architectural styles, the centerpiece of the beautifully proportioned building is a great Renaissance-style dome rising over 300 feet high. Most of the rest of the building, inspired by the British Parliament, is designed in Gothic style. At around 900 feet long, remarkably, at the time of its construction, this was the world's largest Parliament building. The inside of the vast Parliament building is as grand and magnificent as the outside, and was decorated by many of Hungary's foremost artists and craftsmen of the era. More than 40 kilograms of gold was used in order to lavishly gild the building's interior. The main entrance to the building is via a stunning grand staircase, which wouldn't look out of place in an imperial palace. At the foot of the great staircase is a bronze bust of Imre Steindl, the building's architect. Sadly, he went blind during the construction of the Parliament building and died in 1902 before it was finished, so he was never able to see his masterpiece complete. Of all the nearly 700 rooms in the Parliament building, the most important, of course, are the council chambers used by Hungary's members of Parliament. On very rare special occasions, however, Parliament has met not in the council chambers, but in the Parliament building's architectural highlight and structural centrepiece, the Great Dome Hall. Here Parliament sat in 1896, for example, to celebrate the 1000th anniversary of the foundation of Hungary.
We are in the heart of the Hungarian Parliament, under the dome. The dome is supported by 16 pillars, each of them also showing a Hungarian king.
Since the year 2000, the dome has also protected Hungary's most precious historic relic, the Holy Crown, which over many centuries was used for the coronations of more than 50 Hungarian kings.
In the very middle of the dome, you can see the Hungarian Holy Crown, which is an 800 years old object, and by that it is one of the oldest crowns in Europe. It is so dark here because of the crown itself. Since the crown is a very historic object, it has to be preserved from light. It was brought here in the year 2000 to reinforce Hungarian legal traditions.
Today, a ceremonial changing of the crown guards takes place hourly. The Holy Crown has great symbolic significance for Hungary, but the last time a king was actually crowned with it was during World War I, as a result of Franz Joseph's death in 1916. As it turned out, Franz Joseph's successor ruled for just 2 years until 1918, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire and their allies Germany were finally defeated. The result of this crushing and humiliating defeat was not only the abolition of the Habsburg monarchy, but also the total disintegration of the once great Habsburg Empire. Given that defeat in World War I was the cause of this, it's ironic that the war had in fact been started by Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia in 1914, following the assassination in Sarajevo of Franz Joseph's intended successor to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. As things transpired, World War I would also be a very significant factor in the demise of another of Europe's greatest imperial dynasties. Once the war started to go badly for Russia, the Tsars too were toppled during the Russian Revolution in 1917. The stage for many of the most significant and dramatic events of the revolution was the Tsar's vast royal palace at the heart of St. Petersburg. Today, St. Petersburg's Winter Palace is home to the world-famous Hermitage Museum, which houses a fabulous art collection visited by millions of people a year. Constructed in the 1750s during the reign of Empress Elizabeth I, remarkably, it was built at exactly the same time as the almost equally lavish Catherine Palace, the Empress's summer palace in the countryside. Of all the Russian royal family's many palaces in and around St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace was perhaps the most opulent of them all. Dwarfing many of the greatest palaces in other European empires, the spectacular Baroque facade of the Winter Palace, decorated with grand, imposing statues and embellished with the finest stucco work, is over 800 feet long. Inside the palace, on the upper floor, above an extraordinarily grand ceremonial staircase, there are more than 500 magnificent state rooms, designed to impress all who saw them with the majesty and might of the Russian Tsars. Here, from the Great Throne Room, the last of the Tsars, Nicholas II, who inherited the throne in 1894, ruled over the vast Russian Empire as the last of Europe's supreme monarchs with absolute powers. Proudly using his official title of His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor and Autocrat of all the Russias, Nicholas II was in no doubt of his God-given right to rule over his 125 million subjects. But he was also a private man who disliked public life and wished he could spend more time with his family. And so inside the vast Winter Palace, Nicholas had a small section of one of the wings redesigned into a series of cozy private apartments, including this library, so that he and his family could live as if they were in a relatively modest English country house.
Nicholas basically lived in this small, really very concentrated world. He was creating such a cozy life inside the huge palace. In fact, this library says a lot about him as a personality. Nicholas II was really a family man. He had interests like good English gentry: shooting, eating, spending time with family. That's it. Probably the worst and the best document about Nicholas II is his diary. If you read it, it's a shocking experience. You start to read it and you expect to find something about political life. What was going on in the country, you think about 1905, First Russian Revolution, Russian-Japanese War, First World War, etc. You can find in this diary such notices like, Prime Minister came at 9:30. Sadly, he stayed so long that I had no time for shooting. Not even one political comment. But that's his life. He had no questions about his country, and he couldn't understand what's going on. But the problem was that he was emperor of the huge country. And that's why cozy spot by a fireplace looks nice, but that's not enough. He had to become a statesman. Sadly, he never became. And that's the reason and the tragedy of all Russian history in that moment.
Throughout the first decade of Nicholas II's reign, there was growing unrest across the Russian Empire against his absolute and autocratic rule. Matters came to a head during the Russian-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. On Sunday, January the 22nd, 1905, thousands of peaceful demonstrators marched towards the Winter Palace to present a petition to Nicholas II, calling for an end to the war, workers' rights, and a constitutional parliament with elected representatives. In response, the Tsar's troops opened fire on the unarmed demonstrators at various places in the city, including at the Great Triumphal Arch that had been erected a century earlier to celebrate Russia's victory over Napoleon.
Across the city that day, hundreds of people are shot, many more are wounded. This was to become known as Bloody Sunday.
This so-called Bloody Sunday massacre, followed soon afterwards by defeat in the war against Japan, led to mutinies in the army and navy, and workers' strikes all across Russia.
By the autumn of 1905, it's clear to Nicholas II's advisors that revolt and rebellion cannot simply be quashed by military means. And Nicholas's closest advisors persuade him that real constitutional reform is needed if full-scale revolution is to be averted. And so, in the middle of October 1905, Nicholas II is persuaded, much against his own instincts, to sign a manifesto introducing into Russia for the first time an elected national parliament, the Duma.
Bizarrely to modern eyes, the location for Parliament's first meeting in April 1906 was the great throne room of the Winter Palace, from where Nicholas II was accustomed to issuing his autocratic decrees. In this photograph of the remarkable occasion, the elected parliamentarians are standing on the right-hand side, while the counts and countesses of the Tsar's court are standing opposite them, in all their finery.
That was more or less such a shocking for many people experience, because for the court to see members of the parliament who were elected somewhere in the far corners of Russian Empire, it was an unusual experience in itself. They practically never saw normal people in their life. For the high officials, it was completely incomprehensible that somebody would interfere into their activities except of the emperor. They were used to report to the emperor, just to the emperor, but not to anybody else. And what does it mean that Parliament can discuss how much money this or this ministry gets and whatever, how it goes? For them it was a shock.
Russia's first tentative experiment with democracy lasted just a couple of months or so before Parliament was suspended by Nicholas II, who'd become increasingly exasperated by its attempts to restrain his sweeping powers.
The problem of Nicholas II as a personality was that he couldn't cope with the idea that somebody else rules his country together with him. He couldn't understand that people are elected and then they express people's opinion how to develop the country, how to solve this or that problem. He couldn't accept it. He was still the only ruler of the country. And that's why 12 years later, full Russian Revolution took place and destroyed it all completely and swept away all that country that existed before that.
When it did finally happen, the full-scale Russian Revolution of 1917 was again triggered by Russian military defeats, this time in World War I. With millions of Russian soldiers killed in seemingly endless battles, the bloody losses on the front line bred ever-increasing discontent at home. An even harsher winter than usual had also led to desperate food shortages and skyrocketing prices, which, along with anger at Nicholas II's failure to accept democratic reforms, resulted in widespread workers' strikes and demonstrations calling for an end to his autocratic rule. Matters came to a head in March 1917 with the mutiny of numerous army regiments in St. Petersburg. Finally realizing his position was hopeless, Nicholas II was forced to abdicate the throne, and a new provisional government stepped in, comprised of liberals and moderate socialists. Unwisely, as it turned out, while the Tsar was placed under house arrest in another of his palaces, the provisional government used the Winter Palace as their headquarters. In particular, they set up their council chamber in the Malachite Hall.
This Malachite Hall originally was a reception room of the emperors. And in fact, it says also a lot about them. They couldn't get rid of the imperial past, because they were new democratic power. There was a chance to move somewhere, to be associated with something different. No, they stayed in the palace, in the reception room of the emperors. And that's why, as you can imagine, for people's imagination, when October Revolution took place, there was no difference, even in the image, between imperial power and provisional government. They were all in the imperial palace. And that's why taking the palace was like destroying the old power.
The successful storming of the Winter Palace during the Communist October Revolution is one of the most famous and dramatic events in history. Yet surprisingly, there was almost no resistance to the attack or bloodshed. As the Bolsheviks, under their charismatic leader Lenin, had already won the battle for the hearts and minds of a large proportion of the Russian people, they were able to persuade the provisional government's forces and the rest of the city to surrender, almost without a shot being fired. And since even the Winter Palace itself was now defended by just a few dozen military cadets, the game was up for the cabinet ministers of the provisional government holed up inside.
And so when Lenin and the Bolsheviks stage their rebellion on the night of October the 25th, they find the Winter Palace left almost defenceless. The Red Guards are able to storm into the Winter Palace and arrest the remaining ministers of the provisional government without any resistance at all.
Today, in one of the small rooms, which had originally been one of Tsar Nicholas II's private apartments, a memorial plaque records the historic events that took place here.
Soldiers and sailors came into this room with their representative of new power with them, and they told the ministers of the provisional government that they are arrested. And then sounded probably such a fantastic sentence: "Your time is over." And in fact, it is really such a paradox or irony of fate. The small room was planned for family dinners of Nicholas and Alexandra. And suddenly, it opened a new chapter in the history of mankind.
The ministers of the provisional government were imprisoned in the fortress across the river. But worse was in store for the deposed Tsar and his family. Half a year later, on July the 17th, 1918, the former Tsar Nicholas II, now referred to simply as Mr. Romanov, was executed, along with his wife and all his children. The execution of the former Tsar of Russia and his family was not only a pivotal moment in Russian history, ushering in 70 years of communist rule, it was also the final nail in the coffin for the autocratic imperial dynasties whose great empires had once held sway over a vast proportion of Europe. Napoleon's French Empire, the Austrian Habsburg Empire, and now the Russian Tsars were all consigned to history. And the age of empire was over.